Hello, I'm Devin, and you're listening to the 6th episode of Pioneers, an ongoing series of conversations with the designers, engineers, and inventors who shaped computing as we know it. A quick housekeeping note. You're probably familiar with the show by its original name, Tools and Craft. That name has now expanded to refer to Notion's entire blog, which is coincidentally where you can find all past and future episodes of this series, Pioneers. So today, I'm floored to be talking to Mei Li Khoe. Mei Li is a designer, and she has tightly integrated her loves of prototyping, dancing, DJing, glitter, and engineering into making all sorts of novel ways of interacting with the world. She has an especially sharp eye for recognizing the opportunities that open up when you have new mediums in your hands. Mei Li has worked on too many cool things for me to list them all, so here's just a tiny sampler. While Mei Li was at Apple, she worked on the first iPhone, and she was also part of the team that invented Force Touch, among many other things. Later, she was the VP of Design at Khan Academy and co-founded their long-term research group, where she explored what potential futures of education might be. And just in this last year, she launched a virtual world called Makespace with a number of collaborators, which takes the dry, boring rectangle that Zoom and other video chat tools take for granted, and instead turns it on its head and makes hanging out with friends or collaborating with people in virtual space spatial and fun. So Mei Li, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I've been really looking forward to this because this hits a bunch of my favorite topics, and also I just wanted to hang out with you more for a long time. So this is going to be a blast.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, totally. So one of the themes that has really jumped out at me from studying your work and from talking to you is just how embodied your thinking is. You have a lifelong love for dancing, and that seems to have had a huge impact on the way you design interactions and animations. For example, you've talked about how the Apple Edit app screen animation is a lot like a Tahitian dance with that has a lot of hip shaking in it. If anyone has no idea what I'm talking about, if you have an iPhone or an iPad, and you like go to try to edit your home screen of apps, you'll see that your apps like shake and you can kind of imagine a hip sway. So I'm really curious, like how have you involved the physicality of our bodies into interaction design?
Like the first thing that jumps into my mind is just having conversations with people about how things should move. I don't know if this happens to other people, but just having these actual movements, like dancing out with my hands or my arms, how things should move or be arranged in the screen. It's something that you wind up losing when you've got a bunch of static mocks and you're not having face-to-face conversations with each other. But I would say it's definitely permeated in that way and just the way that I talk or think about things. And sort of similarly to that, I think the entire conversation about spatial interfaces and how spatiality plays out for both UI elements winds up coming into play because as a dancer or as a performer, you think about how you get on stage, what you do when you get on stage, what happens when you're going off the stage, how you go off stage, what does a finale look like? What does the introduction look like? There's a flow to doing performance work as a dancer as well as the movement itself. And I think all of that plays into the work, right? Like how does an element appear to you on the screen? What do those transitions look like? Do they make sense? Where does the thing go when you're not looking at it? I think a lot of that's probably played out in my work almost in a way that it's like I don't even know that I'm thinking about it. But it's definitely jumped out a lot when I wind up miming stuff in conversations with other people. That's probably when I notice it the most. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I guess I'm kind of dancing through this."
I love that concept of performance. I think my background is engineering, and I've gotten more into the product design space in the last few years. And when I had my like pure engineering hat on, I was very much focused on what are we trying to achieve on the page? Okay, does the page show that? Okay, cool, we're done. Whereas like that idea of what does the entrance look like? How does someone get introduced to this thing? How does information leave the page when you're going to the next piece? And that's incredibly important for them to understand how the pieces fit together, as opposed to this like big abstract concept, which it can be hard to build like a mental model of what's going on with a product if you don't have all of those things tied together.
Mhm. Yeah, I think related to that is also, there's the mental model and then there's the, like, does the motion make sense? aspect of it? Like, do you want this to be a heavy thing or a light thing? Should it be easily movable? Should it not be easily movable? Like, where is it coming from? And also, like, is this pleasant? Anyway, those are all questions that wind up coming up for me when I think about like how things move on a page and how they relate to each other.
Those are really interesting dimensions to think about. What's your heuristic for deciding whether or not something should be heavy versus light or easy to move versus hard to move?
I mean, ideally, and we haven't gotten here yet when it comes to interaction and design, but like ideally, a thing that's going to have ramifications that are heavy for you, like deleting something, should actually feel heavy, while as something that's just like not that big of a deal, like just maybe rearranging things, for example, like that shouldn't feel heavy. So I feel like it should, ideally, UI, like, reflects the way that you interact with it reflects something about what's going to happen as a result. You know, it's a kind of the equivalent of, like, the, "Are you sure you want to delete everything?" Like, it's kind of funny how, like, RM-R is just it's so easy to type, but it should actually feel like lead, you know?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a great point. You were talking about how now that everyone's basically remote almost all the time when doing knowledge work, with some exceptions, of course, it's sort of changed the way that we can communicate with people when we work with them.
Mm.
As you've been working on Make Space, which also like leans into that paradigm of being on screen. Well, actually, before I ask this question, can you describe what Make Space is to our audience?
Well, so Makespace is a couple of things. From an interaction standpoint, it's an entirely new way of spending time together online where, you know, you break out of the little tiny static rectangles that we're mostly locked into, and you can actually have control over creating a whole vibe and move around while you communicate and spend time with other people. And then sort of at the next level of meta, the sort of the values behind it were are all about how to further humanize and create care and create spaces that are amenable to care and caring culture and creative culture while spending time together online. So I guess like another way of putting it would be a lot of the time when we spend time together online, it feels about as cozy as a corporate conference room. How about instead we create spaces where we actually want to be in them with people we care about and are excited to go back and make them feel like ours. So,
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, why is it so hard to make a vibe in Zoom?
um, there's a couple things. It's like you don't actually, the space doesn't exist. It's almost as if you were walking in an infinite white plane, right? And then you came across a bunch of people for a second. And every time one of you talked, everybody clustered and all looked at you, including one person holding a mirror so that you're looking at yourself. And then that's all there is. And as soon as the conversation is over, you all disappear into that infinite, you know, plane of white space. Well, as if you think about the way that we gather in real life, you know, there's the choice of where you spend time and all of the choices that go into how that place is arranged and how you interact into it. Those are all design choices that you're not making any sort of close parallel to when you're in a place like Zoom. I'll say this as having been a DJ, one of the things that really irritates me is when people set up a dance floor and they push all the chairs to the outside of the room facing in, right? It makes it so hard to start a dance party because everybody's looking at the dance floor. And so, you know, what's the lighting, right? If you keep the lights all the way up, a lot of the times people are more self-conscious. You know, where's the door, where are the speakers, where's the DJ, like all of those types of things are things that you think about as a person who throws events. And then as a person who attends things, or like if you and I were going to go hang out, I would think about, okay, like, well, what is appropriate for like you and I to go spend time in? Is it going to be like a park? Is it going to be, I don't know, the children's museum? Is it going to be a zoo or a cafe? And if it is a cafe, which cafe, depending on what we're going to be doing? You know, there's just like a million tiny choices of atmosphere and arrangement inside that atmosphere that go into our actual human interactions when, you know, it's not in the middle of a pandemic. So when we spend time online, suddenly all that stuff is stripped away and we're left with, yeah, the equivalent of a corporate conference room. And it's sad.
I really feel that. I think a lot of people I know say that it's just really awkward to talk to people on Zoom, even a lot of people that you really care about. Like I find it almost like awkward to talk to my mom on Zoom, and I've known my mom my whole life. And I think you're onto something here where like it strips away all of the affordances that a space gives you. Like
Yeah.
if I invite you to afternoon tea versus to like drinks at 11 p.m., both situations are pretty similar in a lot of ways, but just by inviting you to one versus the other, it's like sending a different signal of, the kind of experience that I'm looking to have with you. And with Zoom, you can do a little bit of that by saying like, bring your red wine or bring your tea. But it's not like the whole place doesn't sort of bend itself to trying to create that vibe. You get a completely different vibe depending on where you're inviting someone. One, like if you're inviting them to a wine bar at 11 p.m. versus tea time at like 2 p.m., you're going to get a completely different experience. And even the waiter is going to serve you really differently.
Yeah.
And the music in the space is going to encourage you. Like in the wine bar, it might be really loud, and so you have to lean in and you get like physically closer. Versus like a quiet tea, it has like peaceful piano in the background or something like that, and you have a very different kind of like wholesome, whimsical experience maybe. And Zoom, like you could do that. I think it's not impossible to create it, but Zoom does not help you at all.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And kind of getting back to something that we were talking about earlier, as a dancer, thinking about how I get on stage, how you get off stage. I remember at a really early age, the teacher being like, a certain people in the audience can still see you like out in the wings. So, make sure that you keep dancing until you're like all the way off, all the way through the wings, that type of thing. And that also applies with social interactions, right?
What are the wings for web design? Like what's sort of the analogy there?
Oh, I guess like a really easy version of the wings. The wings are useful in interface design because if you deliberately have a little bit of whatever things in the quote unquote wings peeking out, that's how people that are going to use the thing know that there's more stuff there. So that's when you sort of like in a list view, for example, you deliberately design the line height for the majority of people being able to see some cut off last element so that they know there's more, for example. Or if you've got, I don't know, if your page is 500 units tall and there's going to be more than 5 elements in it, then maybe you want to make sure that each of the elements is less than 100 elements units tall so that there's a thing peaking at the bottom so that people know that there's more. That's what I would think of as kind of the waiting in the digital wings.
That makes sense. Yeah, like a lot of menu bars have that too, of like being just out of sight, but you can kind of like turn your head metaphorically to see it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've played with other stuff too, with like face detection and parallax and operating systems. None of that stuff has ever stuck. But you could imagine doing that where you sort of move your head to the right side of the screen and some stuff peeks in, or you move your head to the left and you see some stuff peeking on the right hand side. But there's been a bunch of experiments with things like that over the years from different places. But I don't know. We'll see if it ever happens. There's a lot of cool stuff that's possible with UI design, operating system design. That just like a lot of it doesn't wind up happening because it's like splintering of hardware, or there's like lack of economic incentives to actually do that cool thing.
The mapping too can be really tricky, I think. Like from a theoretical level, I would expect VR to be extremely intuitive. But when I put on a VR headset and I like turn to the right, something is off. Like it's not turning like quite correctly, and so it like doesn't quite there's a mismatch between what I would see in the quote unquote real world versus the virtual world. And so
Hmm.
that might just be a technical problem. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it too much, but I imagine there's some of those disconnects where like conceptually it's sound, but practically the implementations that currently exist are make it kind of not that useful. I am optimistic that VR can actually fix that, for the record, but it just hasn't done that yet in my opinion.
Hmm. Yeah, this stuff, it can be tricky to get stuff right. Um,
Yeah.
and 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 tricky to make it worth it as far as like how much work needs to be put into implementing and testing and making accessible and all of the things that happen when you actually ship real product.
Totally.
Speaking of which, I should mention that all of the stuff at Makespace, it exists right now not as like a shipped public version. It's something that, we had spent a bunch of time in playing in like a first stage prototype and a second stage prototype. But I think more than anything, that initial thing that we put out in the world last year was like a provocation. And it seems like it succeeded in doing that. Like I think a lot of people have drawn inspiration from it. I'm excited about having provoked new things to have happened. But I want to be clear in case anybody's listening and is like, why am I not using it right now? That's why, because it's not like a launch thing.
Where would you like it to be in 5 years? How would you like people to use it?
I would love for it to feel sort of co-owned by the people that need it and use it most. But we'll see what happens. It's its own little beast, and it's been pretty organic so far. So we'll see what happens.
I also really like what you said about having the space be sort of persistent, sort of beyond the people themselves, where like you create this thing that you can come back to and it's like a place you go to, as opposed to something like a Zoom video chat, which is like, I have my personal meeting room or whatever, and you should kind of only go to my personal meeting room if I'm there. It's not like a place you would want to go to if I wasn't there. Whereas you could have more of a public space like a library where you might want to go hang out with people, or you might go and read by yourself. You might meet strangers, and there's a little bit more serendipity that happens in those situations, I think, because the thing that connects you is the space, as opposed to a person who had to like make a plan and bring people in.
I think that's part of the reason that House Party was so popular to the point where it stopped being reliable at the beginning of lockdown about a year ago. Yeah, so what was interesting about that thing is that like once you were sort of present, people hopped in and out. There was like a lot more spontaneous kind of like getting together and not sort of being present and available, or not being present of like other people that you knew being able to hang out, as opposed to this like very formal, like, okay, I'm going to send you a link and we're going to hop in now. I think that's like another dimension of this stuff that doesn't get talked about as much, as like the sort of spontaneous third place, like you were saying, like I'm here because it's a place versus I'm going to your face when it's there. I guess there's that term, right? The third place, which is not home and it's not work. It's this other place where people spend time. And we're lacking that right now, and we don't really have that in the digital realm. So it would be cool if it was that. And it'd be even cooler if it was a place like, what we propose with Makespace, that you could rearrange the furniture, or like break off into different little clusters very organically, or like walk around very organically instead of being locked, essentially strapped to your conference room chair.
What have you been using for your third space in the last year? Like, what's been sort of filling that gap?
Oh man, I don't feel like I have one. For a little while at the beginning of the pandemic, like we were trying to do that with House Party, where there was like sort of an ambient presence and people could kind of like hop in and hop out ish. And that was a spot. But I haven't really felt like I've had that at all, like nothing close to it.
When you say we, is it like a group of friends? Is it your family, who or colleagues?
Both friends and family. And that was like, yeah, that was a year ago. It was a short experiment. Yeah, I guess since then, probably like using our Makespace prototype. I should mention that Weiwei Su is really spearheading it right now. So as far as like where it goes in the future, I think we will see where it winds up going. But Makespace is a place where I've spent time with other people, and you can drag in an animated GIF of a bonfire, which we did, and then we all brought in a bunch of little transparent marshmallows on sticks and held them over the fire. And
That's so cute. I love
we
that.
gathered little seats around it, and yeah, it's been cool to see how people wind up using it, even though it's not open or anything, I should say. But yeah.
Yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, it did feel like there was a lot of energy where people realized like, "Oh man, it's gonna be really hard to be around the people I care about for a long time, so I'm gonna experiment with a lot of things." I certainly felt that way, but then a few months in, I just lost steam. Like, it kind of stopped being exciting so much and more just being, like, sad for me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I think, like, I had a lot of really good adventures with friends. Like, we went to, um Minecraft Disneyland, which was a blast. And I
Wow.
actually went with a group of friends who, like, a month before the pandemic, started, we had actually gone to Disneyland together. And so then we went back to Minecraft Disneyland and like went on all the same rides. That was amazing. Um, and we also tried a bunch of like virtual spaces that each were awkward in their own special way. And it's actually pretty fun to be able to explore all of these. But yeah, after some time, it's like you're kind of I'm staring at my computer all day long already. So, and I actually love my computer a lot, but at the end of the day, I was like, you know what, I'd rather just go for a walk by myself, because I need to use my body somehow.
Yeah. I wonder how it's all gonna go when people are able to go out back outside much more often and be around each other, whether or not actually everybody's gonna be like, "I really don't wanna be in front of my screen, like, a second longer than I need to." I wonder how long that'll last. Yeah.
My prediction is that we're gonna get the Roaring Twenties again.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to go wild with like costumes and like crazy parties. I think, like, not everybody, but I think it's gonna be wild.
Yep, I believe it. I'm feeling that too. I feel like people are already egging it on. They're like, "Cool, like, buy your sequin stuff now because it's gonna happen."
Another theme that's really jumped out at me from your work is the idea that when we design things for people, we really have to pay attention to how it makes them feel. They're not just like empty vessels where you can like upload data into them, because that's not how it works. We have feelings about what we're learning about, who we're talking about. What you ate for lunch can like probably affect the way you feel about a product. So what are decisions that you've made that were sort of what you would probably consider atypical that other designers might not have made because you're taking emotional valence into account?
I don't know whether or not there are things that other people might not have come out with, but I guess one of the ones that stands out from really early on is just uh, is making hearts fly out of my head for those first face filters, aka face effects for photo booth. When real-time face tracking first was released and we put it into photo booth on the Mac, there was something about emoting love and how it sort of emanated from your face or your head, that I guess there was like an expressiveness to it and an effervescence to it that I wanted, as opposed to just like, I don't know, sticking a heart over eyes or over a head. So maybe that's one example. Another one that's kind of more recent is I've been experimenting with the visual design for Makespace, and again, like I said, we'll see where that project goes. But I think when a couple of like Weiwei, Aosheng, Julius, and Max had chatted about potentially going the direction of Japanese stationery, and so I put together a whole bunch of stuff and thought about how Japanese stationery feels, and we've been experimenting with what that winds up looking like. And I don't know, there's something about the way Japanese stationery feels that it's so I don't know how you feel about it. I love it. It's so hard if I'm in, like, a Mido store or something to not, like, want everything, and so,
I
you
have an
know
entire stack of unused notebooks. It's my greatest weakness.
oh my goodness, I'm right there with you. So it's like, well, how do we get that? Like, how do we make a digital interface feel like that level of inviting and, warm? That's something else I'm playing with. I would say another thing is probably just, like, the care I put into the artistic direction and frankly, like, who I hired and empowered the people, to have a voice as much as possible. I frankly, I wish it was more at Khan Academy because so much of the educational space, like when you look at enterprise or stuff that gets sold to district or like things in education, you've got the stuff for early learning, which a lot of it is sort of borderline patronizing in its visual style. I'm sure they like study it and like it, whatever, works well for their KPIs or whatever. But then so does like Miffy, which is this beautifully designed, like mid-century traditional, at this point in time, classic Dutch character, right? It's just tight as graphic design and illustration, just incredibly well executed. And then there's so much sloppy stuff in the early learning space that just makes me sad from an aesthetic standpoint. Like I said, maybe they test it and it's fine, but and then there's all this super dry stuff that uses, like, stock imagery, and it's, like, so sad looking, and people are supposed to use it in their classroom, and it just kind of broke my heart in some kind of way. So just the emphasis on the illustration, the visual design, and the creative direction from for how we went with things in the Khan Academy design team, and you know, the contributions of work of Tabitha Young, Natalie Fitzgerald, and Jacob Greif, and Warren Schulheis, I think, are like, and Elizabeth Lynn, of course. When I think about all of the people on the team that really contributed a lot to that, we all really wanted that joy and the fun and colors, and also like a visual direction that embodied a constructivist pedagogy, in that it conveyed visually the coming together of lots of different disparate pieces in the way that like knowledge is constructed in someone's mind versus just being like handed down by like one uniform. For example, if we'd gone with like one very uniform clean line drawn style versus like a more collage aesthetic, we would be conveying something different. So that's another spot where I feel like I put in a bunch of effort to make sure that, we actually cared about that and cared about how students would feel and people would feel arriving at the site and using our stuff. And like I said, I wish we'd been able to take it even further and do even more in my time there, but I hope that software and education is able to push a little bit more on the visual realm. I think a lot of the times it's just not. I don't know why it just doesn't wind up being so valued, or maybe it's like budget, or maybe it's incentives.
I have some guesses of, I mean, some of the reasons that might happen, which I think one is there's a strong mindset that I grew up with of like, you should care more about utility than how it looks. Like the way it looks is not important, or it's sort of silly. And just like what you were saying about how things that when you want to make something that is going to be deleted, you want it to feel heavy. It's like it's not just about the looks. It's not about it being pretty, though that's certainly nice and like makes it feel more inviting. It's about like does the way it looks and does the way it feels make actually match what it does and what it's supposed to be doing for you. Because if it does, then you're going to understand it better. Just like how when I wear a fancy dress, I'm probably not going to start painting, probably. Whereas I might, if I'm going to go paint, maybe I'll wear an apron, or a crappy t-shirt that I got for free somewhere because I don't want it to get dirty. And like the fact that I'm wearing a crappy t-shirt tells you like if you spill a drink on me right now, it's gonna be fine. I'm like not gonna get upset. Whereas if I'm wearing my wedding dress or something, maybe I'll be a little less happy with you. And I feel like an app or a tool or any product that you're using can tell those stories too of like how it should be used.
And I think in the case of the Khan Academy design stuff, a lot of it for me was I wanted the learning and the fun to be associated, and I wanted it to feel welcoming to students and students' rough thought, rather than feeling like an interrogation where they were either going to be right or wrong, and that they were empty vessels, and that we were all going to follow the banking model of education that Freire coined, where they were going to just have a bunch of knowledge poured into their head. Like, how do we break that down visually to convey, like, no, you are a part of this. We're in this together. Like, your thinking matters, etc. It's like, how do we do that? And I think that really at the core of it, a lot of the times, especially in education, interfaces wind up speaking their pedagogy. And if all they care about is the fact that some internet thing or some expert holds the knowledge and a student is seen as an empty vessel that has no thought that's of value, then usually the interface and the functionality conveys that. And that isn't my philosophy of education, for what it's worth. So
You were saying before how Japanese stationery is super welcoming and just like you just want to touch it. And I feel like a lot of Apple design does that for me too, where you just like see the iPhone and you want one because you want to hold it in your hand. You want to like feel how it feels, and the software feels that way too. What do Japanese stationery makers and Apple designers do that's sort of a shared practice, either intentionally or unintentionally?
I think something that I feel is in common with both Japanese stationery and Apple stuff is that people care and they put that care in, and that the care that's put in by a designer is also able to be carried through in the execution of the thing because it's being valued by whoever it is that's in charge. It's considered part of the value proposition of what you're getting, right? Like part of the reason that you like that thing, part of the reason that you're a customer of that thing, part of what makes it succeed is the design. And so it's not something that isn't part of the core value proposition. Unlike, say, for example, many years ago, banking software was something that was not the core proposition was like, okay, well, you can just, the core proposition was the bank. It's like a place to put your money. And like a side effect of it was like, okay, cool, like maybe you want to see some stuff about it. It wasn't considered like a competitive edge in what was being sold. And I think as a result of that, the people who actually designed and actually cared and knew how to put all of that care and craft into the details could have the time and the autonomy to do that without somebody who doesn't have any taste telling them like, oh, that doesn't matter, like we don't have time for that, we just need to like do XYZ right now. I think a lot of craft type of work isn't highly valued by businesses who don't have that at their core, and that isn't part of their main value proposition.
I feel like also once if you're in an environment that encourages it, and if you yourself are paying attention, I have a lot of faith that people figure out ways to get better at the thing.
Yeah,
Maybe not immediately, but like just attention is such a magical thing. Like if you pay enough attention to a problem, it'll tend to get better. And when I say pay attention, I don't just mean like worry about it. I mean like really seek out solutions to the problem.
yeah.
And you can just like keep chiseling away, and ultimately it will usually get better. It's one of the most amazing things that I've seen in organizations where like the company doesn't seem to care at all about X, but then there's a really strong like cultural push to care about X, and then suddenly just it's like a lens that has been like refocused. And after if the cultural change was really intentional and consistently pushed, after the course of a few weeks or months or depending on what it was, it feels like an entire ship can actually turn and really refocus on that. Now it's hard to do,
Right.
but, like, once you do it, then suddenly things start getting done that were, like, not getting done before, and, it's kind of incredible.
It's true. I think it's very tied into learning and just the entire process of learning, right? I think it's like if you really put attention on something, attention and intention, like, it's kind of amazing where you can get after putting all those hours into something that maybe you didn't even see that way before.
Another place that I've noticed personally, just having my attention focused on it has made me a lot better is around language. One of the things I've been excited to talk about is our shared experience of learning Spanish. With you lived in Colombia last year with your partner, and I've spent a lot of time in Argentina, where my boyfriend is from. And I'm probably projecting here a little bit, but I know for me personally, the experience of being like only okay at Spanish and then spending a month in a Spanish speaking household has had a lot of really interesting emotional effects on the way that I learn. And it's made me really realize how important emotion is in a way that I didn't before. And like one of the ways is just that I'm so much more motivated to learn Spanish than I ever was before because I want to be able to talk to my boyfriend's mom. I want to be able to have a conversation. Whereas when I was studying it in school, I always enjoyed language, but there wasn't that like deep emotional connection that I had. And so I just learned a lot slower. But it also means that failures, or maybe failure isn't the right word, but moments of not being able to communicate are also that much more emotional and challenging because you want it so badly and it's not really working. So can you talk a little bit about your experience of living in Colombia and what that has taught you about education and learning?
Yeah, sure. One thing I think I learned living in Colombia is just how physical the language is. We spend so much time typing words on a page and thinking that we're expressing ourselves. But I feel like after spending that time in Colombia, I feel like the actual words, what you get from a written word, as far as what you would get from talking to a person is really kind of a small percentage because it's so physical. In Colombian Spanish, the inflection, the breath, the eyebrows, micro movements, there's so much stuff happening that over time I'm realizing goes so much deeper than the actual words. Again, coming back to the dance, like the different ways that people are even set up around each other, like circular layouts versus, grid layouts of people in the room, who's taking up airtime, how people are moving around each other, and all of those things. In general, I enjoy more sort of participatory crowd noises, which I know are just much more the norm in some cultures than others. And the same thing with like shows, right? Like the culture of a classical music show tends to be very like everybody needs to be super quiet, while as like so many other shows where you yell back and there's call and response and there's all that stuff. Like in thinking especially about like Black American culture, there's just so much more responsiveness generally during the shows. And how does that show up in digital media is another thing that I always think about. Like how do we get to yell back, like how, or like, yeah, the movie theater experience is another one, the tennis match, like what does it look like when you can actually like hear much more responsiveness all the time? And I think that's one of the things that's like with digital video conferencing, there's so much assumption built into like one person speaking at a time and nobody else reacting, which is so weird to me. Like there's so many of the like video conference software where it's like whoever's speaking, I think it was Google Meet that did this. They'd like make their face big. And then if someone else spoke, they'd make their face big. And that's just like built on the assumption that nobody else is going to make any noises or like say anything.
And that assumption is probably really good for certain things. And like, personally, I'm actually glad that people don't react in classical performances. Like, I like being able to listen because like classical music has such a wide range from like really, really quiet all the way to the loudest, grandest thing. And if you had people reacting during the quiet parts, you couldn't hear it.
Right.
But at the same time, yeah, if you're like at a rock concert and people aren't screaming their heads off, like it's probably not a good concert. And
Right.
so, yeah, so, like, I think the range is something that's exciting to me. Being able to pick your toolbox based off of the kind of vibe and situation and relationship that you want to have with the audience and with the medium and that sort of thing.
And I guess one of the things that happens now is that so much of the stuff that we create is like really catered to like super corporate conversations. And so that's what you get.
Right. Like Zoom is really solid and stable because a lot of companies spend millions of dollars to pay for it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think these other more experimental ones are really fun, but like I wouldn't invite my grandparents to that because they're not comfortable with trying super new, like Zoom is already a stretch for them. And to do like a really experimental space, like Make Space, for example, um, they would be scared. Like they wouldn't feel comfortable. So I think that's part of it is that the sort of work conference style, which
Mhm.
is so refined and is quite good for a very particular purpose,
Mhm.
that's what we end up getting stuck with because it's the thing that quote unquote actually works right now.
Totally, totally. Although it's interesting how like a FaceTime call feels very different from a Zoom one. Anyway.
True. Yeah. Actually, what do you think it is about it that feels so different?
Um, I actually think that it's a lot of little things that add up. So part of it's the Chrome. The Chrome holds a vibe. I think we can't, as much as Chrome in software tries to get out of the way, it causes a vibe. So I think that's one of the things. A lot of the times when you're on the Zoom call, you're like in a browser. There's still a bunch of buttons. There's still some stuff across the top, etc. So there's that. I think FaceTime tries to be a lot more neutral. So a lot of the times when you're in the call, you're really only just looking at the other person's face. There's not a whole lot of other stuff on the screen. So I think that's one of the things. And that's, I mean, I think that's just talking about the one-on-one conversations. That's probably the main part. But then of course there's all those algorithmic choices about like who you show. Are you in a grid view, or are you in the like focus on person and you are a smaller person? And what am I lighting up? And am I ducking the audio or not ducking the audio? I think all those things make a difference too. They all add up, like it's just like each of them feels like a small decision, but I think that all of them wind up adding up to the experience. But the one that jumps out to me is the Chrome, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I think where the attention of the designer really makes a difference. Like if the attention of the designer is focused on building something for a corporate client, then just all the little decisions they're going to make are maybe not even intentional. They just kind of intuitively pull towards a particular direction that sends some signal versus the other. One of the things for FaceTime for me too is that you usually connect via your phone number. So you can
Mhm,
only FaceTime people who you like have their Apple ID or their phone number.
mhm,
And for me, giving someone my phone number is like a pretty intimate thing to do. I don't give my phone number to that many people. And so,
mhm,
like, FaceTime feels like the place where I only talk to people that I know pretty well or I trust or a friend of a friend at least. So it's kind of like tied back to that entrance piece where it's like, how do you come into this medium? And the answer for this one is like a very a specific number.
yeah, but, like, why are you even here? How did you hear about this spot?
Totally. And so this is actually a really good segue into the last thing that I wanted to dive into with you, which is that I think I'm a really big believer that the moment by moment decisions that you make in your life are really what determine how you spend your time at a macro level. So if you can have like a really grand theory, but if the small choices you make day to day don't actually align with those theories, you're not going to actually get those results. So, let's say Zoom really wanted to commit to making Zoom feel fun and whimsical, but they keep making the same choices that they've been making. I just don't think they're gonna really make that much progress. Or like concretely, they've added the backgrounds, which and the filters, which are a great first step, and I enjoy using them. But roughly everything else in the app actively contradicts those things, in my opinion. And so it doesn't really they kind of feel weird to like paste on a background in Zoom. It feels a little inappropriate for the space. It's like if
Mhm.
you showed up to a work conference wearing a Halloween costume. It just feels weird. So I'm curious, like, what are like those minute methods and practices that have guided your work when you're either working individually or when you're working in a team, to make sure that the things that you're building actually align with what you have in your head?
So you know how, like, in game design, um, there are sort of small, medium, long, and potentially longer loops of things that you're keeping track of, right? So, like, I don't know, let's just use a simple example like Pokemon Go, right? Like, you're catching little Pokemon everywhere you're going, but then, like, every once in a while, like, you, like, get enough for some level up, right? So that's like the medium loop. There's like the small thing, and there's the medium thing, and then there's like the bigger thing. It's like I totally agree with you that like the little tiny choices add up, and then but also the medium sized ones and the long ones. And so I try to create structures so that the long ones are explicit and they're spoken about and we're checking against them, right? That's like the ideal way, especially if you've got like a team because otherwise people don't necessarily prioritize things the same way to come out with those outcomes. For my personal life, I think it's like can be a lot less like explicit and maybe that's good or not. But I think a lot of the times like the things that I gravitate towards wind up being sort of like implicitly understood by me and so and just by that by a side effect of that being something that's deeply important to me, I'll gravitate towards it, right? So it's kind of like if you hold a thought in your mind that you're like, "Okay, like, I want things to feel this certain way," and then you're faced with a decision and you're like, "Does this feel this certain way? Is it going to add to this thing or not?" Then it's easier to make that decision because you know what you're trying to head towards in the long term. And then making sure that you're checking against it in the small, medium, and long term, I think really helps kind of like designing a little game for yourself out of how you live your life. So to be super, super, super nerdy about it for a second, like, one thing I try and do is, like, every year, I have a couple of overarching things that I know are gonna be important to me that year, and I break those down in a spreadsheet because I'm a dork, and and think about, like, what are actual concrete things that I'm working on that go towards that thing, and then I, like, literally write down what things would happen as evidence of those things, and then create a structure for myself so that week over week I'm looking to see how I'm doing on that thing. And that way if something is at least like failing silently, I know about it. It's not so silent because once a quarter I'm going through and looking how I did for the entire last quarter on my like weekly way of looking at things and seeing whether or not, there's like gigantic pockets of what I want to be working towards that like aren't happening. I've made this structure not because I'm I'm like a weird combination of person in that I'm like naturally on the one hand like extremely chaotic. I think that like the lateral connecting and thinking is happening a lot, and I can be extremely generative and have more ideas that I could possibly execute on like in one lifetime. All of those things are no problem. But on the flip side, like I need structure, otherwise I'll just go off in a gazillion directions. So these structures that I'm creating are like an attempt to find something that I can relax into and allow me to feel reassured that I'm like checking in on things and the things are overall on a day-to-day basis, like you said, going towards the things that I want. They're hard for me to maintain. It's almost like a challenge for myself, but it's also reassuring because then I feel less ungrounded, I guess. I feel just like I have something to come back to. Like this past me created this thing that's going to help current me check in and make sure that all of my actions are adding up to the things I want them to add up.
That resonates really hard with me, where a lot of my friends tell me that I'm the most organized person they know, and I'm like, that's only because I'm also extremely chaotic. And so if I didn't do that, I would get truly nothing done. It's always hard to tell what's going on in other people's minds, you know. It's just your subjective experience, but to me it feels chaotic as heck. What are some of the things that concretely that have gone into that spreadsheet?
One of the ones that's maybe really fun to mention is if I have a creative urge to immediately follow up on it. Even if it's like at a stupid time in a stupid place that doesn't make any sense, just do it. Just go with it. Because I think that also as a person who is like a little bit chaotic and generative, you and especially as somebody who's like been employed for a long time in various jobs, like I had developed strong muscle of suppressing those creative urges when I was like, I just want to do this random thing right now, and then this other voice would be like, you can't do that right now, you need to focus on this thing that needs to get done by tomorrow, right? So last year I was like, what if I just fucking do it? And so, like, week over week, I was like, "Did I do it? Did I just go with some random creative urge?" I guess one of the ones that's more recent that maybe could be exciting for you to hear, because we haven't talked about this yet, has to do with, like, writing. I have so many goals about writing this year. I think that one of the things that's been a challenge for me has always been I just work on stuff, and I'm just doing that, and I'm never documenting it or publicizing it or, like, publishing my thinking behind it. And so I feel like there's a lot of the thinking that I put into things that I haven't taken the time to like write down in a way that is much more digestible and articulate for other people to internalize.
With that first one you said, by the way, the goal of like letting yourself do whatever creative thing you feel like doing in the moment and making sure that was like a lot more meta than I was expecting from the list, but I really like it.
Yeah, I called it flex creative muscle when I want to. And and it was funny to see some of the things I did. Like it was not expected. Last year, for example, at some point in time, I was like, sometimes I hear something and I love it, and there's an emoji that has hearts over the eyes, and I really want an emoji that has a heart and an ear. So I just drew one and, like, put it out there. That was it. That was the project for the week.
So I want to leave with one last question before we wrap things up, which is when you have these creative ideas that you sort of let yourself fall into, or when you're faced with a bigger design problem, what does an afternoon of prototyping actually look like? Like you have a blank page or a blank whatever in front of you. Like what do you do?
One of the things that I've noticed that I do over time is I build up a lot of little it's almost like the equivalent of having like a little toolbox that you might carry around if you are somebody who works on physical things. I feel like I have a digital version of that I try and build up over time. And I have a lot of aids to try and context switch, especially now because I'm working on a bunch of different projects. Like I'm not working on, just one thing all of the time. And so, sitting down involves opening up whatever the aid is that I've created for myself, whether that's like notes on a piece of paper or a bunch of drawings or some conversation I've had with someone, wherever that is, I need to load that in first to like recreate the context of what I was trying to do. And then usually, I don't tend to actually start with something blank. If I do, it's only after I've gathered a bunch of things that I like that are related to it. So for example, I guess it isn't necessarily like prototyping in the motion sense or an interaction sense, but in a visual sense, if I'm working on doing a visual language that looks like Japanese stationery, I'll collect a whole bunch of shots of what I like of Japanese stationery and start from that. And then similarly, if it is a prototyping thing, that's interactive, if it's digitally interactive, or if it's like a in real life thing, I'll still be thinking about a whole bunch of other sources that will feed into that to remix. And then, I think everything from there goes into, it depends a lot on the medium. With prototyping, I'm thinking a lot about like, what am I trying to learn here? If what I'm trying to do is land on an interaction that feels really great, then I'm going to just like tunnel in and focus just on that one interaction. If what I'm trying to prototype is like a flow, then I'm going to try and do the minimum amount of fidelity necessary to see whether or not a flow is going to make sense. And by minimum amount of fidelity, I don't mean like just make it look like shit. I mean like, what is the closest approximation that I can create using the least amount of effort, time, tools, etc., to learn whether or not this is actually going to be a good idea, or learn whatever it is that I need to learn about whether or not something's going to work or not. I think that there's always been this debate of like, how much to involve everybody that's going to be using the thing, how much you're just drawing from your own inspiration, your gut and your intuition, how much you're iterating and testing along the way with people. And it's interesting having worked in different organizations with very wildly different schools of thought. At Apple, we did not do user testing the way that, it's like almost the opposite of Google and doing the A/B testing with the, I don't know how many shades of blue it was. And I kind of wish that that debate wasn't so much like an either or. I think that on the one hand, I've seen people not work enough from intuition, like not develop or be hard enough on their own designs from an intuitive standpoint, not have any sort of vision or opinion at all, which I think is not great. And on the other hand, I've seen people lean too much into that and not do any kind of testing and not talk to anybody and just kind of be too much in the ivory tower and then just like fall flat. So I think it has to be a little bit of both. And there isn't like any sort of magic formula. And it's almost like kind of a waste of time to debate like either or. Like so many things are very debating either or, which, almost nothing works that way. So
Yeah.
yeah. So it's a little bit of a bunch of stuff, I think. And then the other thing is that oftentimes in my past, a lot of the prototyping involved, like a buildup of the little pieces that were going to go into it over time. And then sort of like, you'd have a lot of drawings maybe to begin with, and then you'd slowly start bringing those into some other format. And this is just specific to digital prototyping. And then, have like a little test prototype on one side that just checked for that like one little key piece of code using something simpler, then building it into something a little bit more complex. I'd say almost always at the end of the day, when I look at something that I've done, I have trouble believing that I did it because the whole time it was a series of smaller steps to get there. And if I look back, for example, at like code that I've written, it's hard to believe that I wrote all that code and I can't remember having written it, or I look at things that I've drawn and I can't remember having drawn all that, because I really try and break it down into those, the smaller steps along the way. Otherwise, it's too overwhelming.
I really want to keep asking you questions, but this has been a really fun conversation, Mealy, and I'm really glad that we took the time to do this. So thank you so much, and I really hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been super fun, and like looking forward to next time we have a chance to chat.